gentlemen, you are listening to the Fighting Families podcast with Preston Cave. We are in a spiritual battle, and we have a real enemy. That enemy is not our family. It's the goal of this podcast to help you fight for the family. And now, welcome your host, the Mission and Discipleship Coordinator for TBM, Preston Cave.
Hey guys, and welcome to this week's episode of the Fighting Families podcast. My name is Preston Cave, and I'm your host. And today we are sitting in the building of my home church here in Granbury, Texas, Lakeside Baptist, and we're with Pastor Mark, who is my pastor. So, Pastor Mark, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Preston. I just look forward to us just talking about some things and seeing what happens.
Yeah. Well, Pastor Mark, I've been wanting to have you on the show for a while, and I'm sure we'll have you on the show in the future for other topics. But every time I would think, okay, well, what am I going to talk to Pastor Mark about? It could be about anything because you have such knowledge on everything. And even the way that you preach is, in your series, you talk about things that are real relevant. So I know that I could come to you and say, hey, let's talk about whatever the topic may be. But for today's episode, I really wanted to talk about the topic of finding the perfect church. Like, how do we find the perfect church? And I'll tell you where that idea was sparked from in just a moment. But with this topic, I thought we need a pastor's perspective. We need some pastoral advice for families to know how to find the church that they need to get plugged into. But where this was kind of all sparked was in a conversation that I had not too long ago when I was just out and about in the community. And I was talking to this one particular person, and we were just talking about life. And then, the topic of church and church attendance came up. And I just said, well, hey, where do you go to church? Or do you go to church? And I was surprised by her answer, and it really burdened me and broke my heart. And I know that you and I have had conversations about this topic before, so I thought that you'd be a perfect person to talk to. When I asked her, well, do you go to church anywhere? She was a pastor's kid growing up. And her family still has a lot of people in her family that is in the ministry and involved and stuff like that. But she looked at me and she just kind of looked down and she said, well, I don't really go to church anywhere. And I said, okay, well, why? And she said, to be honest, Christians have really ruined church for me. Now, I resonated with that, although I never would have had the boldness to actually say that, but she did. And so it really broke my heart for her and for what she had dealt with. But I thought, man, this is a topic that we need to really kind of get a hold of and talk about, because I know that she's probably not the only person who has felt like that. I know you and I felt like that some times before. But it's important for us to understand why church attendance is important for our families, for us, what the church is, what the church isn't, and all that. So today's topic is how to find the perfect church. But before we dive into that, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, your family, and all that good stuff.
Sure. Well, I'm from New Orleans originally and didn't grow up in the church. And
okay, I'm sorry. I'll talk slow then.
Right, exactly. Louisiana. Yes. But my parents divorced, and I moved to Shreveport with my mom when she remarried and met some Christian teenagers, and they shared the gospel with me. I became a Christian in 1980. So it's been almost 40 years. So now, looking back, it's been an incredible journey.
I was born in 1982, just to show how old of a Christian you are. So
there's some great. Met my wife at the BSU, the Baptist Student Union. We call that BSM now, I think. And so she and I started dating then, and felt called into the ministry. I was a business major and just wanted to make lots and lots of money. So I was going to be a stockbroker, have a finance degree. I was at LSU in Shreveport, but felt called into the ministry my senior year. And at the same time, my best friend from the BSU, Malcolm Yarnell, who's now a professor at Southwestern and our teaching pastor here at Lakeside. We both felt called in the ministry on the same day in different places. So we felt encouraged by that and traveled to Southwestern and felt called to go to seminary there. And my biggest thing, because of my personal struggles in my past, was that I just didn't feel like I could be a pastor. So I knew that I wanted to be a missionary. Missions was the real heart of why I was going to seminary. We graduated. We had our first child. We have 6 now.
6 kids.
That is our church growth program. So anyway, so
it's
we just had one back then. We felt called to go to the mission field. We were in Malawi, Africa for 2 years, running a medical clinic and working with churches there, doing discipleship. And it was just an amazing experience for those 2 years. Came back, and God just closed those doors. And so to become a pastor was a real challenge to my spirit, because I just didn't have the confidence to think, that it would be something I could do. But obviously we know it's God's strength, God's power.
Yeah.
So I submitted to that calling and pastored 3 churches, pastored in Dallas, pastored in Plano, and now I've been here in Granbury at Lakeside for 12 years. And so it's been an amazing journey, and working with some amazing folks here in Granbury.
Yeah, and you've been my personal pastor for the last 6 years, and so
it's been awesome. I can't believe it's been 6 years.
I know, it's crazy. Well, maybe not quite. I mean, I guess January, February would be almost 6 years now. So, but I count it a privilege to be under you and your spiritual leadership. So
it's been amazing.
Thank you so much for being on the show here today to talk about this topic. So let's just kind of dive in. When we talk about this issue of how to find the perfect church, I guess the first place we need to start is, what is the church and what is the church not? So let's just kind of help our listeners, give us some pastoral advice on what the church is, what the church is not.
Well, I just think the church is made up of people who follow Jesus Christ. And of course, during the pandemic, I think it's been interesting because we've had to come back to our biblical definition of what church is. We know church is not a building, church is not a service, all those things. And so we've seen how God's used the pandemic to create, this idea, or help us to be reminded that church is where you are, and worship is what you're doing, and serving is part of that. And so I've often said to my congregation over these last 9 months that we have created churches on every corner, in a sense, and in every neighborhood, and pastors and deacons and teachers. And so that's been very healthy to me. So just as long as we understand what it's not, I think it refocuses us on what the Bible is telling us the church is, which is just a gathering of believers and followers. So
and so when we think about, like, and I keep thinking about this one lady, and I completely understand where she's coming from.
Sure.
But I think sometimes if we're not careful, we will start to, lift the church up on a pedestal, or put the church in an unrealistic light.
Right.
And think that, well, gosh, they're not perfect anymore. But the truth is there a perfect church?
Not a perfect church. And, I think the one theological belief that we don't have to debate, even with atheists, is the depravity of man, that we all can agree that none of us are perfect. And even after we become followers of Christ, of course, we know there's that sanctification process that doesn't, complete until we're in the arms of the Lord in heaven. And so relationships are messy outside the church and inside the church. And we can't ignore, that he tells us to love one another. The world would know that we're Christians by our love for one another. It doesn't always happen, but that's what God's called us to. And he also tells us to love our enemies. And so whether you're outside the church or inside the church, he's giving us that command. And so I think back to all the girlfriends you and I had when we were growing up. They broke our hearts, but we didn't say back then, I'll never love again. I'll never pursue another girl again, because that's life, that people break our hearts, and people inside the church, people that say they're Christians, they're going to break our hearts. But that doesn't negate what God calls us to. He says, don't forsake the gathering of believers. And so we have to remember that what God calls us to is greater than our experience.
Okay. What God calls us to is greater. Well, okay, so you said this. You said there's no perfect people in the church, whatever, but that doesn't include pastors, right? Pastors are perfect people.
Yes.
You're going to really ruin my worldview of you if you say that you're not perfect. But it sounds like that's what you're saying.
Well, listen, I try to be that fellow struggler, that even though God gives us a standard as far as leadership, that we aren't to be gossips, and our family is to be in order, and all those things, those are important. We are still going to have our moments. We're still going to have our sin struggles. And sometimes those sin struggles will disqualify us from the ministry. And we've seen that, moral failures and all those things. But there's also a lot of just typical sin struggles, whether you're just not walking, you're just not filled with the Spirit in that season of your life, or whatever it might be, which is why pastors, of course, need accountability to make sure that those things don't lead to deeper and darker things that would, actually destroy our ministry. So, you and I have seen that even working together, that as we struggle with, certain things, we all have a thorn in the flesh, and we all have a sin struggle. We all have certain things the devil tempts us to, that we just recognize those things. I've shared with you over the years, sometimes it's been a lot of my past struggles with the way I grew up, that I sometimes would misinterpret people, misinterpret events. And, that all goes back to that depravity. That has to be addressed. Of course, you can't let it go unchecked. But once you
acknowledge that it's there,
once you acknowledge it's there and share with people who hold you accountable, there's several different mechanisms in our church that does that help me to stay on track. And I want that, because I want to have a continued successful ministry. I want to hear, "Well done, my faithful servant." I want to hear that at the end of my life, of course, and I know you do too. So pastors have their struggles, and I wouldn't say we're necessarily on a pedestal at all.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's helpful, the idea of identifying and recognizing and acknowledging depravity, even among pastors, because this topic of how do we find the perfect church, first off, there is no perfect church, so stop looking. And if there is a perfect church, I like how you always say, if this church is perfect, don't join it, because you're going to ruin it.
You'll ruin it, exactly.
But I think that it is important. I think one reason why you felt like you probably couldn't be a pastor when you first got started, you felt like you couldn't be a pastor, is probably because you had an unrealistic expectation of what pastor meant, And I think sometimes some of our listeners might struggle with the same thing I've struggled with in the past, of thinking that pastors are supposed to be somehow more spiritual than the average Joe, when in reality they're just strugglers along with it. And I appreciate how you've always acknowledged that among in front of our congregants, to make sure that we know that you're not perfect and that you shouldn't be held on a pedestal.
Right.
But that still doesn't leave the fact that sometimes, and I say this just because I have another friend who I've had several conversations with, and one of the things that he has said before is he doesn't necessarily believe in God because of the hypocrisy in the church. And the only thing I could say was, well, you're right. I mean, but there's hypocrisy even at Walmart too.
That's what I often say, Preston, is that hypocrisy is not a church problem. It's a humanity problem. And if you want to find a hypocrite, you just look in the mirror. I mean, we all have that, but we also misunderstand sometimes the definition of hypocrisy. We need to look to what Jesus said. It's not the gap between where we are and where we ought to be, because we all have that. I'm not where I want to be. There's always going to be that gap. Again, that goes back to sanctification. But Jesus, talked about hypocrisy, and specifically the Pharisees, in that they thought they'd already arrived when they hadn't. And so that's really hypocrisy. Is that in the church today? Yeah, it is. But again, it's a human problem more than it's specifically a church problem. So we don't want that. We don't want to lead with that. We don't want to see that as rampant in the church, but we acknowledge that it's going to always be there.
Which again goes back to acknowledging depravity.
Yes.
And that depravity is just a human issue. And so anytime you collect humans together,
that's right,
in the name of anything, you're going to have that type of hypocrisy. It still hurts, though, Pastor Mark, when the church is preaching one thing,
of course,
and yet sometimes they still struggle with the sin in it. So I guess the next where we can kind of move on now is now that we've kind of established that foundation, how do somebody, maybe a listener who has been out of the church for a while, or maybe has never been in the church but is now looking, what are some characteristics they should look for? What are some non-negotiables in a church that they should really begin to look for as they pray about where they can get plugged in? And then I guess we need to talk also about why it's important to even get plugged into a church.
Well, of course, it's important to be plugged into a church, first of all, because it's God's gift to us. The church is how God reveals himself. It's how we do get on that road to sanctification. It's how we become more like Christ. And obviously, being a follower of Christ isn't a Lone Ranger kind of a thing. It's not something where it's just individual. Westerners have created have turned Christianity into an individualistic, pursuit, when it's really not. It really is about the church. To be a Christian and not be a part of a church just doesn't make sense when it comes to the way Jesus taught us. And so we know it's important, and it goes back to whether you've been hurt or not. We know it's important, just like any love relationship is important that we work on it. And so that's the church. And so to find that church, you may make some mistakes in trying to discover a church home. I want people to look for a church where their spiritual gifts can be used. I want them to look for a church where the Bible is being taught. I want them to look for a church where the emphasis is as much or more about what's outside the church, into the community and into the world. Those are the things that I would want people to look for in a church, because that's what I want to look for in a church. In other words, instead of looking for the perfect church, you look for the church that can use your gifts. If their children's ministry is not up to par, and you feel like you can help them to get to that next
Instead
level.
of complaining about that, just jump in and start volunteering, right?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. That's why we as ministers feel called to go to a church, not because we think, oh my goodness, I found this perfect church that's going to help me in all these ways. We think in our minds, I'm accepting the call to this church because I feel like I can help them.
Yeah, that's good. I heard a sermon once before talking about the body of Christ and how, as Christians, if you are a Christian, you're listening to this now, and if you're a Christian, then you are part of the body of Christ, which means you belong to the body of Christ, which is why the church attendance and commitment is so important. But I heard this pastor one time share it like this. He said, let's say that you're walking down the street and you look down, like you turn a corner, you look down, and all of a sudden there's this arm, and it's just sitting there. It's just an arm without a body. You immediately know that something bad happened right there, because you recognize that if there's an arm without a body, then that means somewhere out there's a body walking around without an arm, and that body is less functional and less able to accomplish the task for which it's called to do.
Sure.
And so in the same way, you might be the arm that local body needs. And so I think when we're looking for the church, there's no perfect church, but there is that church that you and I are called to be part of.
Yeah.
And it's because we're each members. Like, I may just be a finger, but I need to start looking for the church that's missing a finger, or could use a strengthened finger or something like that.
Definitely.
So that's good. Okay. So you say look for a place to serve.
Yes.
Recognize that if this church is struggling in one area and you say, I've got these gifts, start, instead of complaining about it, get involved with it.
Sure.
So let's say now that you and I, we've been involved in, we're not church members, we're not pastors, we're just church members now. And we've been involved in church for quite a while. When do we know if God is calling us to leave that church? Because that's another issue, really.
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. And, the only thing that I can think about as far as scripture goes is of course, Paul and his missionary journeys and helping Timothy at Ephesus and some of those things. And so that's my only point of reference from the Bible that I can think of at this moment.
Yeah.
And so, of course, Paul had that vision to not go to Macedonia at that one point. And so I think it's just very much listening to the voice of God in your life, and to know if that's, just like you knew Sarah was somebody that you would marry. It's kind of one of those things. Maybe it's less personal than that, but in the same way, you're listening for God to call you to a specific place and believe that that's what God has called you to. Even when you're interviewing, sometimes you might be thinking of, okay, well, this person and this person may not, gel with my theology or my practice, orthopraxy or whatever. And so maybe those are red flags to you to say, well, I don't know that this is where I'm called. And I've said no to some invitations to churches based on that, thinking that, God is using this particular team or committee to represent the church, and maybe it wouldn't be a good fit.
Yeah.
And that's important, because you want to be able to say no when you need to say no if God's not leading you there.
Yeah, that's good. And so even something just simple is like theology. It's not our job to go into a church that's already established to try to change their theology as much as it's us to try to figure out, okay, can I get on board with their theology?
Sure.
Can I get on board with their mission and vision? And if not, maybe that's not the church that God's called me to.
Yeah, we've seen pastors go to churches and change or attempt to change their doctrine, and I just don't know that that's a healthy way to go. Of course, we saw that more in the past with maybe pastors that wanted to move a Baptist church into charismatic theology, for example, and those kinds of things. And it creates a lot of heartache. You talk about being hurt in the church and being hurt by people. Those things over the years have created a lot of heartache. So I wouldn't recommend that to a young pastor to go and do those kinds of things, but to find a church that does line up with what you believe, which of course there is some there's some uniformity in our denomination. We're thankful for that. Not all the time, but we can know that, they've written their doctrine out on their website or whatever, that you can at least go through it and say, yes, I can abide by these things, rather than saying, wow, this church is way off. I'm going to completely
rescue and revolutionize.
Right.
Well, okay, and I heard a pastor once talk about what's called the MELT principle.
Okay.
And the MELT principle is moral, ethical, legal, or theological.
Okay.
And what he said, unless there's something morally wrong, ethically wrong, legally wrong, or theologically wrong, you really need to be hesitant before you leave or whatever.
Sure.
Because, and the sad thing is, we can sometimes feel like, because of our preference, I don't like the way the music is being played. They're changing the music, or they're changing the lights, or they're too much change. And change is not a bad thing, of course, but sometimes church members can make it a bad thing.
Sure.
And they can justify anything, say, well, that's a moral issue. Well, it's really not. It's just your preference issue.
Right.
But I think that if there is something morally wrong, or like you talked about the theology, maybe you just can't get behind the theology, then you need to pray about leaving and maybe going to another church in that sense. But I think that we have to be careful not to church hop for too long.
Right. I think it's your responsibility to maybe find out those particular things before you arrive. And then, of course, if it happens after you arrive, then I think it's good to at least have conversations with leadership, and at least to see, is this something that would change? And if not, then I need to go on somewhere else, of course. But you hope that if, in particular, those four things that you mentioned, that at least if there's an ethical dilemma there or a moral dilemma there, that those things would be changed and addressed. Theologically, those things may not change. Legally, again, that's into the ethical, that kind of bleeds over into that ethical realm. But, those are difficult. I just think changing churches is difficult as, again, going back to the relationship comparison, it's as difficult as changing a relationship, whereas you may say we're friends, but now we're not friends anymore because of these reasons. So I think those are always difficult, again, thinking back to when Jesus tells us to love one another, to love our enemies, and maybe even we come to an impasse on some certain things, but can we change churches, go our separate ways, and still, respect one another? I think those are important. Doesn't always happen, but I think it's important.
Well, and I think that kind of leads to what happens when we leave, or if we feel like, okay, we do need to leave for whatever reason. We feel like we've got peace by God. How do we leave a church, I think, is important too, because if we're not careful, we'll leave and we'll talk negatively.
Right.
To try to justify why we're leaving. People are going to ask, why are you leaving? What happened? So how do we leave well without hurting the body of Christ and bringing slander?
Yeah, I think it's so important to think of the church more than yourself. I mean, it's very tempting for us to leave and gripe and leave and justify and those kinds of things, where it's healthier, in my opinion, to leave above reproach and to say we had some differences. You don't have to spell out every detail, but we had some differences, or maybe there were some things that I didn't see in the same way, but I wish them well. I think it's also important to let the leadership of that church know. I think we don't see that often again, but I think it's a loving thing to say. We agree to disagree, or I don't see this way. God's leading me to another place, and and then leave it at that.
And that sometimes can help the pastor, because pastors are humans too.
Sure.
And so sometimes they may not readily admit that maybe they were wrong in a certain spot, but after you talk to them, whatever, they think back and say, maybe there was something I could have done better or different. And even though maybe you've left, they still are a better person because of the conversation. So I think that it is helpful to have a conversation with the leadership.
It's very helpful. And I think pastors, and I know this is true of me, sometimes I will so grieve someone leaving that sometimes I overanalyze what could I have done different, or what could we have done with a certain program, and a lot of times it's not these four things. A lot of times it is, like you said, a preference. But even still, even if it's a preference, sometimes I'll just go over my mind, wow, should we change this particular preference? Because I want as many people to be a part of my church as possible. I want everybody to feel like they can thrive. And so sometimes I take it a little too personally. Of course, that's my own struggle to let people let people go, at the same time, but sometimes I'll overanalyze and say, well, maybe their preference should be what our preference is,
Yeah. Yeah. Real quick, listener, if you're listening to this or you're watching this, first off, I want you to be encouraged that you're not the only one who's ever struggled with these types of things. But second off, look at my pastor. He's jacked up. He's insecure. And he,
Yes.
sometimes, so the point is that your pastor, wherever you are, whatever church you attend, also sometimes struggles with insecurities or struggles or challenges or whatever it may be. So instead of talking negatively about them or thinking negatively about them, why don't you stop right now and say a quick prayer for them and for their family, because it really is difficult. And, this whole topic of it all started with that conversation of that one person who said that they've been hurt by the church so many times. And the sad thing is that person was a pastor's kid.
Right.
And that's near and dear to my heart. I know it is to your heart because of our kids. And so please, listener, stop and pray for your pastor right now, and stop and pray for your pastor's kids, because they feel more weight than we realize.
Preston, I thought of when you said that she was a pastor's kid, I thought about when we were starting BSM here in town, and through Tarleton, we had a student that was a pastor's kid that shared her testimony that she had experienced some of that same thing as a pastor's kid, and was really out of the church at that moment. And somebody from the BSM there at Tarleton reached out and invited her to a mission trip, and she really reconnected with the Lord. And through that, and then she eventually helped us start the BSM here in Granbury. And so she's gone on to continue to do some great things in student ministry or in college ministry. And I thought, that's the other thing that we have to remember, is that even if we are soured, even if we're hurt by people, God is still pursuing us regardless. And that's the beauty of God's love for us, is that he doesn't let anyone pluck us out of his hand. Even if we are in that place of whether it's rebellion or being hurt, whatever it might be, God's still going to put people in your life.
That's interesting, because it was such a random conversation with this person that I feel like only God put us together at that moment. And I encouraged her to try other churches, whatever. And so it's interesting that God does place those people. And so I'll say this too, perhaps you came across this video because God is pursuing you.
That's right.
Maybe you've been hurt before, and you have kind of checked out and said, I'm done with church. And for some reason, somebody texted you this, or you just kind of came across this on social media or whatever. And now you're listening. God is pursuing you right now to get back involved in his bride, not for the sake of you benefiting the church or whatever, but so that you can be ministered to and strengthened, and that you can exercise those gifts and talents that God has given you. And I think that's so
true. And I love that you asked her the question, because it is a great question to start with as you're sharing your faith in your community and your world. I'm so grateful that God puts that on your heart, because he puts it on my heart too, because we don't always know the hurt. But we can ask the question. And somebody might just give maybe a more normal answer, but still, just the fact that you answer the question is exactly right, that God not only pursues you, but he puts people in your life to show you that love. And I just think that's amazing. I mean, his love is so great for us. So as much as I worry about my kids being preachers' kids and kind of try to take off that pressure, if they don't want to sing in the choir, they don't have to, all those kinds of things I've said to them over the years. But at the same time, the ultimate goal is that my kids love Jesus, and they, all 6 of them love Jesus. And that's what matters to me the most. Now, can somebody say something ugly to them at church tonight? They could,
Can somebody say something ugly about them behind their back?
Yes.
Of course.
They
somebody
could.
can say that about any one of us.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, the devil has his ways. That's for sure.
That's right. Well, okay. So just another thing before we get ready to wrap up, you may be listening to this and you may be saying, well, what can I do to help with this issue? Have your eyes and ears open to people, and just start asking them about their relationship with the Lord. And you'll be surprised at the number of people who maybe say similar things to that, as that one lady said to me. But you can be a minister to that person and encourage them that, maybe they got hurt or whatever from one church, but that doesn't mean that even that church is like that. Maybe that church just had a bad day, week, month, or year.
You're exactly right. I mean, you just never know how somebody might get crossways with somebody else in certain situations. It's interesting. And again, the devil has his ways, and to use those tricks. And I think the devil delights in putting a follower of Jesus on the sidelines, to take them out of the world of the church and just make them remain in hurtfulness or bitterness or whatever it might be, as opposed to reconnecting and getting back in and discipling someone or leading someone to Christ. I mean, of course, that's what the devil is wanting to do, is sideline as many of us as possible.
That's right. Yeah. Well, as we get ready to wrap up, give us some last minute pastoral advice. If the listener is like the person that I talked to today, what would you say to that person right now?
I mean, the first thing is just as Preston and I have said, God's going to pursue you. I'm convinced of that, because that's the God that I believe in. That's the God we serve, is that he will put people in your life. But, to take responsibility as well and say, what can I do? Because we all have to own our own part of any relationship struggle. I mean, we have to say, okay, where's the plank in my eye, as the Peacemakers book that we have gone through together, where we say, what part do I play in some of these relationship struggles? And maybe it's none, but most likely there's a place in your life where you can say, maybe this is what I can learn in that failure, in that relationship struggle, that I can learn, that I can be better, that I can be more gracious, again, because God doesn't leave it an option for us to love one another inside the church and to love our enemies outside the church. He tells us to do both. He doesn't leave it as an option.
He doesn't specify that the enemy is always the person who's not a Christian.
I wasn't going to say that, but you're exactly right. Sometimes the enemy is right inside the walls. And so we can definitely learn what our planks are, and to say, God, this is the prayer I say at the end of a lot of our invitations at Lakeside. If you can't get there, what God's calling you to do, then just pray this prayer: God, make me willing to be willing. In other words, God, open my heart, soften my heart, because if I'm closed off to what God's calling me to do, which is to be a part of the church — you are part of the church regardless of whether you want to or not — is that God, just make me willing to be willing. Because we talk about David and how half of his Psalms are complaint Psalms. He just says, he's lamenting, he's saying, God, how come life is unfair? All the things that David complains about, but at the end of the day, the other half of his Psalms are where he trusts and he praises God.
Well, and you often say, we don't need to pray what we — how do you say it? We don't need to pray what we should pray. We need to pray what we — you say it so much better than I do. Say it.
Pray what is in you.
That's it.
Not what ought to be in you. In other words, we worry that we're going to offend God by confessing our hurt or being real or being honest. Well, let's face it, he already knows how you feel anyway. So to pray what's already in you, even if it seems inappropriate to you to complain to God. Think about Job and Jonah and all the people in the Bible who complained to the Lord. God can actually use that because you're being honest with God in your prayer life.
And I'll say this, even though it broke my heart that she was saying what she said at that moment, I was almost not relieved necessarily, but refreshed that someone was finally being honest.
Sure.
Like, most people aren't that blatant and that honest about why they don't go to church.
Sure.
They try to hide it for whatever reason.
Sure.
But she at least was honest, and I think that is the starting point.
And God could use it.
That's right. Yeah.
I have no doubt that because of that conversation Preston had, that the Lord is working in that woman's heart even now, that she would, eventually find her way back to the fellowship of believers. I mean, it's so important, and God used it, I'm convinced. And that Preston's right, because she was honest. God can use that. God, I think, God allows us the freedom to choose him or not to choose him, just like the two thieves on the cross. One chose him, one didn't choose him. And God gives us that freedom even as Christians to be obedient or to not be obedient. His desire is for us to be obedient. But, it's like as parents, I can get compliance out of my kids because I'm bigger and louder. But do I want my kids to drive under the speed limit because it's the right thing to do, that they might kill somebody if they're driving irresponsibly? Or do I want them to drive under the speed limit because they're afraid they might get caught by dad or the police? It's two different ways of seeing things. We can get compliance, and God could certainly get compliance out of it. He could force his hand on us, but he gives us, that's what love is about. Love is about allowing people to choose him or not choose him, even after we're his children. And that's, to me, an abuser forces his way in your life. Yeah. God's not an abuser. God is an inviter. God is an inviting God. He stands at the door of our heart, Revelation 3:20. Right. He stands at the door of our heart and waits for that response. Yeah, as Tozer says, he waits for us to be, or he waits to be wanted.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'll tell you what, as we wrap up, I just want to encourage you as a listener. Maybe that's what you needed to hear, because maybe a long time ago you stepped away from the church because you really were hurt, and there was nothing that you did, but it was done to you, type of thing. And then you just kind of stepped away. But then after stepping away, you really began to rebel to the point where then Satan started whispering in your ear, hey, God doesn't want to have anything to do with you ever again. And perhaps today you heard a message that God's not finished with you yet. And it doesn't matter what you have done in the past. It's a matter of what you're going to do right now with the invitation that God is extending to you, even through this podcast and even through Pastor Mark's encouraging words. So I just say this, God has not given up on you yet. So why not begin praying about right now, getting back involved, not just so that you can put on the checklist, I went to church this week or whatever, but so that you can actually get more involved in an accountable type of relationship with other brothers and sisters in Christ who will actually encourage you, strengthen you, and make you, help you become a better person. That's what church really is all about more than anything else. A bunch of messed up people. I like one person says it's one beggar helping other beggars know where to find bread. That's evangelism. But that's also church.
It is, and that's how I feel. And that's how I preach every Sunday, is that we're all, struggling, we're all growing, we're all learning, and God can take every bad situation and redeem it. I mean, because God's in the redeeming business. If the worst thing that could happen to us, Preston, is that we die and God redeems that, then he can redeem anything.
That's right. He can redeem even a negative word or something that was said by the person who was supposed to be our spiritual mentor.
Yeah, that's right.
Man, this has been such a great, helpful episode, Pastor Mark. I really appreciate your wisdom in this. Listen, if you enjoy this conversation and you think, man, I know somebody who could really benefit from hearing the message in this podcast, I'm going to encourage you just to shoot them a text or post it on social media. And that's a kind of a passive-aggressive way of trying to get it, because they're going to see it, but you don't want them to think that it was directed towards them. But post that on social media, share this with other people. And I just, just hope that this has been a helpful episode for you. But as I always say, make sure that you fight for your family today.
You have been listening to the Fighting Families podcast with Preston Cave. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes each week. If you like today's program, we want to encourage you to share it with your friends and family members. To learn more about the resources we have to offer, visit us at www.fightingfamilies.com. Until next time, be sure you fight for your family today.